From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the library, which is the reading and literacy promotion part of the library. But we also encourage not only promoting books, literacy, and libraries, along with reading itself, but we have a special interest in the history of related programs that come out of the Library of Congress's collections that, in the broader cultural sense, are the kinds of activities that promote the culture of books and reading. And what today we're doing in this Books and Beyond talk is taking a look at a topic, an aspect of the WPA arts projects in the 30s, in which the Library of Congress has a long association. And I'm going to outline it for you just very briefly before we start the program. But first, let me say a word or two about the Center for the Book, which was a creation of Daniel Borston when he was Librarian of Congress, to get the Library of Congress to reach out really to the general public as well as scholars in promoting books and reading. And subsequently, we have expanded that mission a bit to include literacy promotion. And our latest project, in fact, are the Library of Congress Literacy Awards, which are initiated and funded by David Rubenstein with a 5-year program, and that fits right into the Center for the Books program. But we started by helping to create state centers for the book, and there are affiliated centers in each state that look at writers and writing and books and reading in their particular states. We also work with nonprofit organizations, including government agencies that have an interest in reading and books and literacy. But here at the library, here in Washington, we work hard on other special projects. One is the National Book Festival, where the center is responsible for basically the author program and an activity called the Pavilion of the States. And those of you who've been to the book festival know that we are able to bring in, with help from IMLS and others, people from all of the states to have tables to show off what they do in their states to promote books and reading. Another popular feature are these Books and Beyond talks. All of these talks, along with, by the way, most of the talks at 13 years now of the book festival, most of the author talks are available on the Library of Congress website. And this program is also being filmed for the website, so I would like to invite you to turn off all things electronic. And also, however, to participate in what we think will be a 10 or 15 minute question and answer period following the presentations. And if you do participate in those, you are a candidate for also taking part in the website discussion following, for which we thank you in advance. This is a special anniversary, as we've talked about, and I'm also I've been at the Center for the Book since it was created, but I'm also a historian and fell in love with the WPA arts projects even before the Center for the Book was created, and worked hard as a collections librarian on a storage collection up near Baltimore, where the Library of Congress had deposited many of its WPA-related collections, and made it one of my jobs to help interest scholars in these collections and to interest institutions who in those days were able to get NEH grants to organize collections, and the LC was not, to go ahead and make these collections better known. However, prior to even that storage collection experience that I had as a young collections librarian before the Center for the Book took over in 1977, the library itself had built wonderful WPA-based collections, beginning with the dissolution of the projects in the late 30s, which all started with the theater project, and then other things fell apart. And for example, in Prints and Photographs collection, some of these wonderful photography collections that were developed already had a way into the Library of Congress and an interest in them. But the story is that once these, and I'm talking theater, writers project, the arts projects, the major HRS, Historical Record Survey, once those started falling apart, the story is, and I've kind of documented it, that in effect Archibald MacLeish, Librarian of Congress in the 30s, learned about and guessed of what was going to happen to some of the federal arts projects that were housed here in Washington as well as out in the country. And somebody said that he drove a pickup truck around to the agencies to pick up the materials. Well, he had other people, I think, driving the pickup trucks. But he did manage to get together a project at the Library of Congress for processing all of the material that still was in other agencies that they were able to give us. And it included, much of the material that ended up in storage. But as I said, it was combined with what already had started. But then the Library of Congress project only lasted about 6 months, which is why in the end a lot of it had to be stored. And so the wonderful story was to try to pull some of this together. And I got interested as a collections librarian and told the story of finding the material and then doing a history of all of the collections at the library, very brief history. And that was in 1983. And parts of this have been digitized, but we're going to talk about resources as we move through with the other speakers. And then we kind of run at the Library of Congress in every 10 years, we take a look at what we've done and what we're working on. And we had a wonderful conference in December 8th, 9th, 1944, where we gathered everyone living that had worked on any and who could come on any of the WPA arts projects. And it was December the 8th and 9th, and it was up in the Mumford Room. And we had Larry Levine was our keynote speaker, and we packed that room, and actually Dr. Billington gave the welcoming address, and something came over the loudspeaker that said, "Stand by for an important announcement." And those of us who were involved in the organization said, "Oh no, what's the worst thing that could happen?" I know, a building evacuation. And that happened just as Mr. Levine was 2/3 of his way through his keynote, and we had to evacuate the entire Madison building, and so everyone was out on the street. And we ended up gathering in the middle of the Great Hall of the Library of Congress to continue the symposium because this building was closed until the afternoon. And that was memorable, but it helped all of us kind of get re-stimulated in what we were working on. And then with the help of the American Folklife Center in 1994, which was the celebration of the New Deal at 75, we brought back again to see how many people were still alive who'd worked on the projects, but we took a kind of a historical view of it. And that was, so that's one of the reasons I was very pleased when David suggested that we take another look at a particular aspect of the Writers Project, which we're going to be doing today, honoring the 75th anniversary of this book. These are our lives. This is a volume of life histories, which you'll learn all about, which was published by the Writers Project in 1939. And I went scurrying back to my collection at home, which someday will be coming to the Library of Congress. The story there is the Library of Congress, as they took in the state guides, we discarded all the dust jackets and put the state guides in the general collections. And one of the things I did when, again, before the Center for the Book, was went around and I pulled them all off the collections and took them up to Rare Book. But of course, they did not have dust jackets, and they're up in Rare Book now. But eventually, my collection, which has dust jackets, will be coming to replace, I hope, that particular collection. And Ann and David and I were looking together at this So what I have in my collection is the second printing of These Are Our Lives, and we figured out they had to know they had a hit on their hands, because in those days, of course, the publishing history is right here in the inside of the book. It was first published May 1939, second printing June 1939, and by then they had all the blurbs on the back. So somebody was looking ahead and thinking ahead. I'm now going to turn the program over to David. We're very lucky, and David Taylor, who himself is a scholar of this period and has a couple of not only books, the author of The Soul of the People, the WPA Writers Project Uncovers Depression America, which is one of the books for sale outside, in addition to the paper-bound version of These Are Our Lives. David is going to introduce the program itself and kind of the outline and what we hope to do during our celebration. So please join me in welcoming David Taylor.
Thank you, John, and thank you for your great support and your dedication to this story over the years. It's really remarkable, I think. And thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure. Appreciate the Center for the Book hosting us, and the library in general hosting these collections that have made so much of a difference in how we regard our history. I'll just give a few words of background on how this book and this event came together. The Federal Writers Project was part of the New Deal's Works Progress Administration. It was a national work relief program. Between 1935 and 1939, the program employed millions of Americans as a way of kickstarting the economy. And arts projects were just a small part of that effort. And so although it was intended as a small, short-term support for many unemployed, the WPA programs in the arts, in art, music, and writing, turned out to be a great cultural experiment that had long-term effects, really. And so, well, what were those long-term effects? Briefly, the Writers Project, in looking at that, we could say it provided an unexpected incubator for talent that was idled by the Great Depression. The project gave some of the best writers, really, of the 20th century, their first jobs as writers at a crucial point in their lives. So people like Margaret Walker, Mae Swenson, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, John Cheever, Nelson Algren, Saul Bellow, and many, many more. The economic aspect is just one part of the answer to what the project's legacy is. FDR himself said, 100 years from now, my administration will be known for its art, not its relief. And so we're sort of 3/4 towards that landmark, and we'll see. We'll be talking about one particular part of the Writers Project and how it documented people's lives. Mary Emma Graham, a professor of English at the University of Kansas, and one of our NEH advisors when we were making the film of Soul of a People that John mentioned, said in Poets and Writers, the WPA was a godmother or godfather for so many writers who had had few opportunities before that point. For example, the largest single impact on black writing before the Civil Rights Movement was really the WPA, not the Harlem Renaissance, unquote. Graham explained that many Harlem Renaissance writers, quote, did not continue to write after the 20s. However, of the WPA writers who were black, more of them developed substantial careers beyond that period, unquote. So when I started researching the Federal Writers Project, I got to speak with several of the project survivors, including Studs Terkel, who championed oral history throughout his life afterwards. He had started with the Writers Project not as an interviewer, but in fact he worked with a small innovative part of the project in Chicago. That was the radio division and creating radio programs. But he called the books that he wrote later oral histories, and musicals that came out of those books, like the musical version of Working. I'd say it would be an offshoot of oral history that as it became popular. He was generous with his time and memories for us, and following his leads and suggestions about the papers and how to find people who were still connected with the project. I was fascinated by their stories and by the stories of their intersecting lives, really, at a time of crisis, and how that incubator project worked. And so that led to Soul of a People. But one of the things that Studs pointed me to was Anne Banks' fine book, First Person America, which contains selections from many of the rich life histories gathered by the WPA writers. She was really the first to rediscover the collections here in the Library of Congress, and so we're thrilled that she joins us here today. The Writers Project had a main goal of a kind of a deliverable of producing state guidebooks, travel guidebooks, as a way of harnessing writers' energies. But to help ensure that those guidebooks got informed by local perspectives, the National Director, Henry Alsberg, incorporated interviews with everyday citizens as part of the plan. And so that came under the folklore division. The project's first folklore director was John Lomax, and he was followed by Benjamin Botkin, a practicing folklorist who set guidelines for the Life History program, and I think Anne will be speaking a little bit more about him. But the W.T. Couch, the project's regional director for the Southeast, put together These Are Our Lives in his own way, sort of independent of Botkin's model. And so the book was published 75 years ago this month, and it showed a new way to tell history. It collected life histories gathered by the WPA interviewers in 3 southern states, and of course he made choices as editor in putting them together. But when it came out, it presented sort of a challenge to traditional historians, their traditional views of sociology, in the sense of which was still considered very much history was kind of the domain of experts, distilling key documents and profiling leaders, and folklorists had their own domain of focusing on tall tales and legends and not living history coming out of people's mouths. So when These Are Our Lives came out, the New York Times reviewed it twice, I think, recognizing its significance. They called it, quote, a history of a new and particularly honest kind, and, quote, an eloquent and important record. And one review hoped it might be the first of a series. However, budget costs with the project would soon shutter the whole Writers Project. Operations would continue, mostly funded by the states, until all the guidebooks came out in 1943, but there was no really second collection of the life histories until really First Person America. So today, in addition to our speakers, Virginia Millington, I'll introduce in a bit from StoryCorps, we will also have 2 professional actors who will bring to life stories from These Are Our Lives. John Stang and Eternanda Fudge they appear courtesy of the Theater Lab here in DC, a leading nonprofit with its own Life Stories program that recently won an NEA grant, as among other prizes that it has received from the DC Humanities Council. And that Life Stories program really resonates with what the WPA was doing 75 years ago. So I hope that the event sort of shows both the origin of what we're looking at in 1939, but the various legacies after that. For me, the best stories, both of the book and more broadly of the WPA collection, which is part of the American Memory section on the Library of Congress website, which really encompasses many first-hand collections, not just of narratives, but of photos, film, audio recordings. Really, the best of these stories kind of evoke a scene from Wim Wenders' film of Wings of Desire. And that film, set in Berlin, 2 angels in ponytails and overcoats walk through a subway car just listening to the unspoken fears and dreams and hopes of people who are in the car, who are not saying anything, but they can hear their thoughts. And that's kind of what I imagine the WPA interviewers were doing. They were often the first ones ever to ask everyday people for their stories and for their lives. And this was at a time in the Great Depression when such conversations didn't happen, whether out of fear or out of shame. There was a lot that people did not talk about. So, and often in these interviews that you'll hear from 1939, that you might read in the book, and neither interviewer nor interviewee knew exactly what was going to come out about. So it really was a great experiment. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Anne Banks, a writer and author of First Person America, based on her research, which was supported by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations. Studs Terkel called First Person America, quote, an inestimably valuable addition to American literature as well as oral history. The book is now available as an ebook and is being recorded as an audiobook and will soon be available on audible.com. And Anne also has co-produced a 6-part NPR series based on the life history interviews, which we'll hear a little bit from also. So please welcome Anne Banks.
Hello. I love that David evoked Wings of Desire, one of my favorite movies, and I love the idea that this was, some what the Writers Project interviewers were up to. It's wonderful to be back at the library. It was home to me when I was working on this project, and I can't even overstate how wonderful and nice everyone was to me here. When I think back on it, I was just overwhelmed. In the late 1930s, Benjamin Botkin, who was the newly appointed director of the folklore unit of the Federal Writers Project, had a premonition and a vision. Botkin, like many intellectuals of his generation, was worried about the rise of fascism in Europe, horrified and worried about possible consequences at home. His vision was of how he might use his new job to counter that influence, to foster the tolerance necessary for a democratic, pluralistic society. In pursuit of this goal, Botkin put the federal writers under his direction to collecting life history narratives from those who would not otherwise have left a record. Federal writers from the folklore unit ended up recording the life stories of more than 10,000 men and women across the country. Among the people who told stories were an Irish maid from Massachusetts, a woman who worked in a North Carolina textile mill, a Scandinavian iron worker, and an African-American organizer in a Chicago meatpacking house. Many Americans at the time had vivid memories of the 19th century. Some of the life history narratives tell of meeting Billy the Kid, surviving the Chicago fire of 1871, making the pioneer journey to the Western Territories, and fleeing to America to avoid conscription into the Tsar's army. These accounts were meant to be published in a series of anthologies that would make them available to what Botkin called an ever-widening public. It was not enough, he believed, to collect the narrative solely as archival source material for scholars. We must, he wrote, give back to the people what we have taken from them and what rightfully belongs to them in a form they can understand and use. 2 anthologies of Writers Project life histories did appear not long after the interviews were collected, and they are classics of the documentary genre. You've just heard about one, These Are Our Lives. But toward the end of the Depression, the Writers Project, along with other New Deal arts projects, came under attack by conservative critics of the New Deal. Red baiting in Congress, together with America's entry into World War II, combined to bring the Writers Project to a halt. And when it became clear the project's days were numbered, the administrators did what they could to safeguard the vast quantity of material that had been collected. As John Cole described, an editorial project to organize the manuscripts was established at the Library of Congress, but it hadn't made much progress when funds ran out in 1941. At that point, some of the material collected was sent back to the States. The rest was scattered around various Library of Congress sites, some to the manuscript division, some to an off-site warehouse, and some crammed willy-nilly into battered filing cabinets that lined the back wall of an office in the library's archive of folk song. In these 8 cabinets were the bulk of the unprocessed life history material. In 1949, the library had issued a status report on the subject of the folklore unit papers that basically amounted to a do not resuscitate notice. Quote, because of the bulk of the folklore unit material and its present condition, it appears unlikely that the library will ever have the time, money, or personnel to finish processing the material unless another WPA is established. And that is where things stood more than 20 years later when a man named Jerry Mangione, himself a Writers' Project veteran, published a history of the project called The Dream and the Deal. In a despairing footnote, Mangione mentioned the first-person stories collected by the folklore unit and deplored what he considered a shocking waste of a precious national resource. When I came across that footnote several years after the book was published, I was intrigued and wanted to know more. Mangione didn't offer any clues in his book about precisely where in the library the neglected folklore material might have ended up. When I called him, he said he didn't know, but he gave me a few names at the library to start my research. And I was trying to remember, John, were you one of them that I called that first time? Or? Yeah, I thought so. Maybe you were.
Kinsey was my boss.
Uh-huh.
And he was the one who wrote the letter to Jerry Mangione saying, sorry, much of this is apparently in storage. Goodbye.
Right, except for these ragged things in the folklore unit.
That's right.
After some phone calls, I did track down a promising batch of papers to the Folksong Archive. No one I spoke to at the library seemed to know quite what was in those file cabinets. The general consensus was, yes, it was Writers' Project material of some kind, but nothing very interesting. I made a trip to Washington to see for myself, and after a week of exploratory delving, I came to a different conclusion and decided to see if I could edit an anthology of the oral history interviews. Soon after I returned to the library to begin going through the collection in earnest, it was shifted from the Folksong Archive to another location, a dusty, dimly lit room nicknamed the Buzzard's Nest at the far end of a labyrinth high in the library stacks. And there I set up shop for the next 8 months. Occasionally someone came by for one reason or another, but most of the time I was alone in my Aladdin's cave of stories. But I never felt lonely. Sifting through the 150,000 pages of material, I was looking to fall in love. And I did, with a collection of people who were by turns scared, determined, funny, and brave, and whose clamorous vitality seemed to burst from the pages. Marie Haggerty, a New England housemaid, talked about when her employer left a $5 bill on the floor, quote, my face burnt like fire, for I knowed I was getting tested. When organizing his fellow workers at Macy's, Irving Fagins hit upon the idea of secretly distributing the union literature via toilet paper dispensers, of which he was very proud. The inhabitants of the file drawers told stories about how they got by using a mixture of ingenuity and guile. They hawked Lucky Charms and patent medicine made from roots and barks and good raw whiskey. They peddled cake flavorings and case sausages. They auctioned tobacco, they fished and smuggled rum, and sometimes aliens, from Cuba to Key West. They worked in coal and granite and cotton and iron. One of the workers told an interviewer, you ain't an iron worker unless you get killed. The women quilted and pressed laundry, stitched shoes, and danced in burlesque shows. They took in boarders and delivered babies, and when their luck ran out on them, they swallowed their pride and threw rent parties, as Bernice Porter described doing in 1920s Harlem. Excuse me. The 80 stories I included in First Person America were not chosen because they were representative of the collection or of the federal writers who conducted the interviews. All the set criteria I had in mind gave way before the sheer size of the collection. Instead, certain stories communicated an unmistakable energy that made itself felt across 40 years. Each of the stories I knew was the record of a specific occasion, 2 people sitting down to talk in a bar or a union hiring hall or on a front porch or at a kitchen table, one speaking, the other taking down the stories. Sometimes the speaker and the listener seemed to share a sympathetic understanding that encouraged moments of special insight. There were unexpected discoveries, Familiar stories seem to gain deeper meaning for the teller. Old grievances found new resolutions. A Vermont farm woman came to forgive her parents for keeping her from school 80 years before. A Jewish peddler who had passed up his chance to prosper in order to raise his sister's children reaffirmed the choice he had made. For a stonecutter's widow, an unaccustomed feeling of pride surfaced as she recalled her struggles to raise her children alone. Now, I hope I'm going to play, this is an excerpt from the radio series, and it was recorded by an actor named Mildred Dunna, and this is a farm wife. Okay. This worked just a moment ago. A Bluetooth error has occurred. Make sure it is, all right, I'm going to try one more time, and then I'm going to. I'm going to just start it over.
Life is nothing but changes. We never used to can things the way we do now. We salted pork down, froze the beef, packed it in oats, and had the root crops in the cellar. One fall, we had a 550-pound dressed hog hanging in the yard. The man went off to Wells River to take up another hog they'd dressed at the same time and left it hanging there, and the cauldron kettle half full of water. They aimed to get back and take the hog down cellar before it froze. It would never do to let pork that was going to be salted freeze. I was all alone with the children, and I waited until almost 12. My husband didn't come, so I took a lantern and a saw and a knife and went out to fetch in that hog. I emptied out the water from the cauldron kettle so it wouldn't freeze and burst. Then I cut up that hog and loaded it piecemeal onto the sled. The worst part was getting it through the front door, but I managed. I had it all done before my husband got home. He asked who had brought the hog in. I did, I said. He asked who helped, and I said, alone. I wasn't wasting many words on him. He was struck dumb.
I love her. She reminds me of my grandmother. Benjamin Botkin stressed the process of conducting interviews in his instructions to federal writers. He believed the best results were obtained when a good informant and a good interviewer got together, and the narrative is the process of the conscious or unconscious collaboration of the two. He instructed the federal writers to make your informant feel important. Well-conducted interviews serve as social occasions to which informants come to look forward. Of course, such advice was interpreted according to the individual temperament and inclination. I was able to talk with 11 of the 41 federal writers whose narratives appear in First Person America. Ralph Ellison described his method to me. I hung around playgrounds, I hung around the street, the bars. I went into hundreds of apartment buildings and just knocked on doors. I would tell some stories to get people going, and then I'd sit back and try to get it down as accurately as I could. Sometimes you would find people sitting around on 8th Avenue just dying to talk, so you didn't have to encourage them too much. Stetson Kennedy of the Florida Writers Project said he established a comfortable atmosphere by interviewing people in their homes over a glass of beer. Quote, before tackling anything as personal as a life history, he said, we naturally established a good deal of rapport with the person before getting around to telling them their lives were so interesting they should be written down. Most people agreed, and the more notes you took, the better they liked it. Frank Bird, an African-American federal writer, became good friends with several of the Harlem residents he interviewed. You can't just barge in and start asking questions of people, he said, who don't know who you are or how you feel as a person. You have to pass the time of day with them until you reach the point where you feel a warm relationship so you can talk, so they can talk. Since the federal writers themselves were on relief, they were frequently accepted as sympathetic equals by those they interviewed. Betty Burke recalled to me how she felt about the Chicago packing house workers she talked to. She said, "We were dirt poor ourselves, and these people were, if anything, even poorer, so I was very close to them. I understood every word they said with all my heart." Many of the federal writers found the project experience offered more than a meal ticket. Benjamin Botkin regarded the life history narratives as the stuff of literature, and he expected federal writers to draw on them as raw material. In fact, many federal writers' field research did influence their subsequent fiction. Sam Ross, who interviewed jazz musicians, published Windy City, a novel that describes the Chicago jazz scene as he knew it in the 1930s. Stetson Kennedy's interview with Naborto Diaz about a gruesome Klan murder later inspired him to infiltrate the Klan as an undercover agent. He wrote about his experience in I Rode with the Ku Klux Klan. Kennedy also interviewed a Key West smuggler who claimed to be Hemingway's principal informant for To Have and Have Not. A Pullman porter Ellison interviewed in a Harlem bar told him, "I'm in New York, but New York ain't in me," a refrain he later borrowed for Invisible Man. Now, trying again here with another interview. This is Melvin Van Peebles.
Take Lenox Avenue. Take 7th Avenue. Hell, take Sugar Hill. Pimps, numbers, cheating these poor people out of what they got. Shooting, cutting, backbiting, all them things. You see? You see what I mean? I'm in New York, but New York ain't in me. Oh, no, don't laugh. No, I'm laughing, but I don't mean it. No, it ain't funny. You see, I'm on Sugar Hill, but Sugar Hill ain't on me. I come here 25 years ago. Bright lights, pretty women, more space to move around in, you know. Son, if I'd have got New York and me, I'd have been dead long time ago. What happened the other night? You heard about that shooting up here in the hill here? Now you take that boy there. I know him. Anybody been around this hill knows him. And they know he went to a bad man. Now what'd he do? Now mind you now, his brother's a big shot. Makes plenty of money. Got a big car and fine office. But he comes up on this hill tearing up people's property if they don't pay him protection. Last night, he walks up to this Wop's place up the street here and tries to tear it up. Now, you know that's a bad man. He gonna tear up the Wop's place, see? Well, you stepped out the door there and a bunch of them Wops showed up in the car and tried to blow his head off. Yeah, he had too much New York. You see, I'm in New York, you see? But New York ain't in me. Hell yeah, he went and got too much New York. You understand what I'm trying to tell you now?
Well, Ralph Ellison was one who listened to Botkin's advice that federal writers should learn to listen for the characteristic speech rhythms and the vernacular. And in his interviews, he began to experiment with ways of capturing the sound of black speech that he refined in Invisible Man. He told me, "I tried to use my ear for dialogue to give an impression of just how people sounded. I developed a technique of transcribing that captured the idiom rather than trying to convey the dialect through misspellings." The Federal Writers Project's primary purpose was to put unemployed writers to work. For those assigned to the folklore unit, the secondary purpose was to collect stories of everyday life from a diverse assortment of Americans. These days, there is no talk of work relief for unemployed writers, much as they may need it. Storytelling, however, is having a moment. In New York City, where I lived, a storytelling event somewhere almost every night. But these are people telling their own stories to an audience. For intimate one-on-one interviews, the story gathering organization that has the most in common with the Writers Project is StoryCorps. I won't say much about that because Virginia's going to be talking about it in a little bit. But I wanted to say that in StoryCorps founder Dave Isay's conviction that every life matters, I hear an echo of Benjamin Botkin's beliefs. Sadly, his vision for the life histories was not realized in his lifetime, but I think he would be gratified to know that the StoryCorps interviews have joined the Federal Writers Project Life Histories here at the Library of Congress, where they will be an invaluable archive of American voices and wisdom for future generations. Thank you.
And now I'd like to ask Hernanda Fudge to come up and who will be reading from the account of Sally Reams from These Are Our Lives. So please give her a hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Them is pictures Frederick drawed. Take one. Which would you rather have? He won't care. He'll be pleased you took it. I've got 4 children with me now. Look like a handful of trouble these last few years. A hailstorm destroyed the crop one year. My house and furniture got burnt up. My boy died of pneumonia. And the land we paid for had to be mortgaged. I lost my husband, but I keep hoping for better days. We don't see no way ahead for Woodrow Wilson to do nothing but farm for the rest of his life now. And Faison had to quit school in the 7th grade to go work. Frederick is in the 10th grade at Gettysburg now and hopes to finish high school next year. He says he'd rather be a farmer than anything else, but he'd like to learn how to make a good one. I think farmers ought to have schooling like other folks so they can keep up with their business. Frederick wants to study drawing too. What he does, he just pick it up himself. Oh, and my baby, Dora Bryan, is in the 6th grade at the Faithful Band, the schoolhouse down the road. I had to become mother to my brothers and sisters when I was 12. So I never go much learning myself. There wasn't no grades when I come along, but I went through the 4th reader. I can read better than I can write, but my children can do all the writing and reading and figuring for me. What I'm afraid of is that we're going to lose the 50 acres of land that we paid for when George was living. All that's been paid so far had to count for the interest. And this year we still owe $700. No, we owe the $1,000 plus 60 more for interest this year. It's hard to keep straight. Mr. Makepeace ain't said nothing to us yet, but we're expecting it any time. I stay scared all the time. I know this is our last chance to ever own a farm. That's what we all want more than anything, to farm for ourselves. If we lose, then it's our loss. But if we make it, it's ours too. I've had to drop burial insurance. Woodrow Wilson's is paid up, and so was Arthur's when he died. We got $100 to bury him with. We hated to drop insurance, but the 15 cents a week counts up so fast when no money's coming in. And if we was to buy from all the agents that come along, we'd be handing out money all the time. They come through the country selling everything. Why, the Watchtower woman thought she'd sell me a book. Anyhow, last fall, a white man come through selling holy stones for luck. He said I had enemies and all the bad luck and trouble I've been having would be changed to good luck if I bought a holy stone from him. Lots of white women has been through selling stuff like that. Once come in and read the Bible to me a while before she started her selling speech. I don't believe in nothing like that. I wouldn't buy it from a strange woman from way off if I did. They'll have to sell their conjure amongst folks that believes in such mess. I know there ain't no such things as haunts and spirits and conjuration. White folks is just trying to make money tempting them that's weak.
Thanks, Senator Nanda. And now I'd like to introduce Virginia Millington. Virginia is the recording and archive manager at StoryCorps, an independent nonprofit whose mission is to provide Americans of all backgrounds and beliefs with the opportunity to share the stories of their lives. She manages the archiving and long-term preservation of up to 6,000 born digital audio interviews annually, and ensures that StoryCorps venues are equipped to capture the highest quality recordings. She maintains archive partnerships with institutions including the National September 11th Museum and Memorial, the Library of Congress, and the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. She has spearheaded initiatives to raise awareness of the StoryCorps' archives and contents, including a partnership with the new museum that resulted in projects for their 2010 exhibit, The Last Newspaper, and their 2011 Festival of Ideas. She oversees the StoryCorps At Your Library program, a national effort to provide public libraries with tools to record the stories of their communities. So please welcome Virginia.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the Library of Congress for hosting this wonderful event and for David Taylor for inviting me to take part. Since StoryCorps' beginning, our program has been entwined with the Library of Congress, and it's one of the things that means most to our participants to have the interviews that we record housed in the Library of Congress alongside all the rest of the wonderful collections. And over the course of the years, it's been wonderful to work with the staff at the American Folklife Center, and we look forward to working with them in the future. So I'm here today to tell you a little bit more about StoryCorps, which, as David said, is a national project with a simple but expansive goal, which is just to provide people of all backgrounds and beliefs the opportunity to record, preserve, and share the stories of their lives. StoryCorps interviews differ from traditional oral history interviews in a number of ways. And to start, we encourage people to record stories with loved ones. We provide suggestions for questions for each participant pair to ask each other, but we don't provide a standardized list of questions for each participant to follow. We encourage our participants to spend time in our booths telling each other the stories of their lives and the stories that matter most to them. And actually, to start, I'd like to play an interview that was actually just recorded last month in New York, because I think it really aptly shows the spirit of the StoryCorps interview.
Okay, Sherrod, here we go. Anyway, I got the butterflies now.
My name is Sherrod Dukes. I'm 48 years old. Today is April the 1st, 2014. I'm located here in New York City at Housing Works. And I'm here with my friend, Glenn Richardson.
And that would be me, Glenn Richardson. I'm 56 years old today. Again, it's April 1st. And I really wanted to ask them, were they joking when they said April 1st? It's a joke. Right. But anyway, and, again, here at New York at Housing Works, which is a healthcare program that I have been very involved with for some time.
Well, you told me this was the Smithsonian, and it happens to be the Library of Congress. So I guess we're doing. Smith? Yeah. All right. So now we're in the Library of Congress.
That's even better.
Yeah, right. So, what story you want to get across today?
Well, I needless to say, we've given a lot of thought and conversation to this, but I think one of the things that I'm most interested in expressing is, how I began and where I am now.
So I think in that very short clip, you can sort of see a sense of the clamorous vitality that Anne mentioned. We believe that when people talk to people they know about the stories of their lives, there's an intimacy there that really allows for powerful stories to be told. StoryCorps began in 2003 with its famous recording booth in Grand Central Station, and recently we celebrated our 10th anniversary. As of now, we have recording booths in Atlanta, Chicago, and San Francisco, and an Airstream trailer, our mobile booth, that travels the country recording stories. There are a number of other projects and programs that we also oversee that are designed to allow StoryCorps to touch the lives of every American family. And one of those programs is the StoryCorps Your Library program that David mentions. In the next month, we'll launch our newest initiative, StoryCorps Out Loud, which will capture the stories of LGBTQ participants across the country with a particular focus on the pre-Stonewall generation and LGBTQ youth of color. StoryCorps was founded by Dave Isay, who used to visit the Library of Congress to hear recordings from the Federal Writers Project. And he described to me the experience of listening to acetate recordings that seemed to take him back in time to pool halls and front porches from decades past. It was at the Library of Congress that Dave was able to delve deeply into the world of Studs Terkel, who was an animating figure for Dave's work and who would later cut the ribbon at our story booth opening day in Grand Central. Dave's pioneering production company, Sound Portraits Productions, gradually withdrew the narrator from the radio documentary, allowing interviewees to tell their own story. And Sound Portraits was an important precursor to StoryCorps. And the quote behind me from E.B. White reflects E.B. White's views on public media, and I think aptly describes not only Sound Portraits, but also the work that we do at StoryCorps. Most people are familiar with StoryCorps through our edited broadcast pieces, which are heard weekly on Morning Edition, or through our animated shorts and books. What most people are not familiar with, though, is the magnitude of our collection, and I'd like to take a few minutes today to speak about the StoryCorps archive and to share some excerpts from our archive of interviews that I think speak to the shared mission of the Federal Writers Project and StoryCorps. I'd also like to take some time at the end of my brief talk to describe our plans for making the collection more broadly accessible. StoryCorps is a born digital collection comprising, as of this week, of close to 55,000 40-minute recordings. The interview records also include participant photos and interview paperwork, which includes participant data sheets, log notes, and release forms. Every recording is captured using the highest quality recording equipment, and each interview record contains descriptive metadata that allows for multiple points of access into the collection. StoryCorps facilitators, who oversee every aspect of a StoryCorps recording, are also responsible for preliminary data entry, ensuring that each interview can be indexed and is searchable. To look beyond the numbers, however, is to see that the archive includes depictions of historical events, anecdotes about famous individuals, and nuanced insights into issues like immigration and identity that are so often decontextualized and abstracted. For example, 2 years ago, we actually scoured the StoryCorps collection for stories about elections, and we discovered not only an account of an election that was decided by coin toss in South Dakota, but also a moving account of a teenager who endured arrest at a crowded polling station in the segregated South. Like the Federal Writers Project, StoryCorps is a project that aims to reveal a side of America underserved and undervalued by traditional media outlets. And like the FWP, StoryCorps travels across the country in search of participants who expand our notion of what it means to live in America. However, there are important differences. The Federal Writers Project operated largely without recording equipment, and the voices of interviewees are depicted through the narratives created by the interviewers. While StoryCorps edits a small portion of our 40-minute interviews for broadcast and publication, the StoryCorps archive represents a set of interviews in which dialect, idioms, emotion, and affect are all maintained. In addition, we provide copies of all of the interviews to the participants themselves, which allow them to have these interviews and share them and use them as personal recollections. One of the interesting things about the Federal Writers Project that I found when I was looking into my notes for this talk was how the depiction of livelihood and occupation served as a shorthand for a description of class, heritage, politics, and more. And so in preparing these talks, I actually took the opportunity to delve into the StoryCorps archive using occupation as a guide. And so in the slide behind me, you can see an approximation of occupation in the StoryCorps archive. These percentages represent interviews in which one or more participants has identified as being part of the listed employment sector. While these numbers reflect or represent in part a different focus on the part of StoryCorps, they also starkly reflect the changing face of employment in the United States. For the Federal Writers Project, illuminating the lives of those in poverty was critical. StoryCorps' multiple initiatives reflect this aim in a different way. The StoryCorps archive includes stories that reflect different forms of diversity, not only including the voices of African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and more, but also the voices of LGBTQ individuals, military voices, persons with disabilities, and the young and the very old. Now I'd like to play another clip from the StoryCorps archive.
Well, tell me more about your father. You seem to have a very strong connection to him.
My father was a bootblack and a newspaper boy. He was brought up by his sister, and money wasn't too small an issue with them. And he started working on the streets around Main and Exchange Street, shining shoes and selling newspapers. As a matter of fact, that painting that I have up there is my picture of him doing that. And one time, as a matter of fact, I was sitting in a doctor's office, and there was an elderly couple in there, obviously foreigners, and they were whispering to each other. And finally, the lady came over to me and admired my boots. I always used to wear boots. Still would, except they're too hard to put on now. Something happened to the boots. and she admired the way they were shined, and I said to her, which was a natural response, I thought, well, my father was a bootblack, and he showed me how to shine shoes, and that's the truth. Mm-hmm. And I was always very fussy about that. And then she had another little conversation with her husband, and she came back and she said, I can tell you're not from that you're not from the old country, because nobody in the old country would ever say that their father was a bootblack. I thought it was kind of an honor. I didn't think it was such a... I thought if a kid earned his living when he was a young kid like that, that was great.
Yeah.
You know, but she apparently didn't think so. And that was up to that point.
So I found that interview because I was very moved by a story in These Are Our Lives that comes from a person who describes himself and his life as a bootblack. And in fact, this is the only interview in the StoryCorps archive with someone who talks about being or being related to a bootblack, although there might be more, I'm not sure. We have more shoe shining interviews as well. So another story that I'd like to play actually comes from South Carolina.
What makes us such good friends?
Well, I think all the memories we've had together, and we had challenges too, because we saw people lose their jobs in the textile industry and the different industries in the South in particular. We saw, large companies move here to the South to avoid unions and to pay lesser wages. And so, we've been in the struggles together. We had the personal struggles, as you were saying, with our families, always wondering if the union was the first place in our life. And we always had to convince them that our family was, but the union was very important to us. And so I think we always thought very much alike. I know somebody said to me the other day, I thought it was interesting, Ruth, we were talking about union leaders, and sometimes it's hard to define what's made you and me be so independent and always still working. When others, they retire and they go on with their life. And someone said to me, folks like you and Ruth are born with this fire inside of you, but others have to be learned, have to be taught, and so that's a learned behavior. And it's really hard for me to understand that sometimes with what we feel, because it's not just unions, it's human rights and civil rights.
Yes.
So I found that interview by actually looking through the archive for stories of people who identified from that small sliver of participants who worked in industry or construction. And I was particularly interested in finding stories from the South because those reflected the stories that were told in These Are Our Lives. And I was actually particularly interested in the stories of women. And so this was one that immediately jumped out at me. And the whole interview is very powerful, as are all StoryCorps interviews, actually, in my opinion. And I think that, in these three pieces that I've played, which again are just a tiny segment of the full archive, I think you can see what I think is a critical and important part of the StoryCorps recordings, and I think really, again, reflects sort of the vision of Benjamin Botkin, and that is the mingling of the intimate and the universal, and the sense that these individual stories can illuminate important and necessary cultural histories. So the first question I usually get when I tell people about the StoryCorps archive is, when will it be made public? And so I'd like to take a few minutes just to talk about StoryCorps' plans for broader access. In 2012, the StoryCorps board approved a multi-year archive strategic plan, which involves a multi-stage approach to greater public access to the contents of our collection. We're currently updating our systems to allow for greater efficiency in transferring StoryCorps interviews to individual participants and partners, and after that step, we plan to make the interviews more broadly accessible in collaboration with the Library of Congress, and also with the goal of creating a shared resource that will benefit the general public, researchers, students, and more. I'd also like to restate the fact that StoryCorps does provide copies of interviews to all our participants, and so depending on how you look at it, there actually are 50,000 StoryCorps interviews circulating throughout the country. And we also provide many interviews to different partners. One partner in particular is the University of Texas at Austin, which is currently receiving the entirety of our histories collection and is cataloging those materials. We also work with individual researchers and research institutions who have accessed the interviews within the archive for use in doctoral dissertations and larger projects. One project of note is a sociolinguistics project at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory that compared sets of interviews from different geographic regions to discern linguistic patterns. However, because of the vast size of our archive and the fact that it is not a traditional oral history project, we are cautious and thoughtful in moving forward in this process. After all, as the Boston College Belfast Project has taught us, it's important to be mindful in thinking about access to these collections and to anticipate any difficulties before anything is made irretrievably public. Above all, we are committed to creating a valuable resource that benefits not only future generation, but maintains the trust our participants have in StoryCorps and the commitment we have to them to treat their stories with respect. And again, I think this is where we really do follow in the footsteps of the Federal Writers Project. And while every interview in the archive cannot and will not be made into a compelling broadcast, a book, or an animated short, we believe that the importance of its archive, with its human voices, reflects a resource whose importance will come not only from our interventions within it, but also from its capacity to illuminate and make accessible the words of those we know and those we don't. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia. And now I'd like to ask John Stang to provide one more excerpt from These Are Our Lives from a young man named Ed Smalley.
History of my life? What do you mean? What is this? What right have you got to ask me for the story of my life? I don't know if I could tell the story of my life so it would be interesting to anybody, but I'll give it a try anyway. Let's go sit in my car while we're talking. I guess the most interesting experience of my boyhood was a trip into Mexico. When I was about 10 years old, my father and mother went on a visit to Mexico. One of my uncles lived there in Veracruz. He was a cotton broker or something of the kind. Well, anyway, he was connected with the cotton business, and I guess he made money because he lived in a big house. It was a stone house. The windows were covered with iron grill work. My uncle had been in Mexico a long time, and both he and his wife spoke the language. They had Mexican servants. I remember how astonished I was the first day we were there. We were at breakfast, and my uncle was talking to my father, suddenly turned his head and gave an order in Spanish to one of the servants. I don't know why it startled me, but it did. I must have been staring with my mouth open because my father laughed. That visit made a great impression on me because everything was so strange. The people dressed different and spoke a different language. Even the signs on the business buildings meant nothing to me. They were in Spanish. I remember how strange it seemed. One time, my uncle and aunt dressed in Spanish costumes and took us to a fandango. My mother and father could not dance the fandango, but my uncle and aunt could. They danced with the others. My uncle wore a long red, yellow sash, and I thought he cut quite a figure. I guess we stayed about 2 weeks, and I'll always remember that trip to Mexico.
Thank you, John. Thank you both for bringing that to life. And that is the end of our presentations. If people have some time to ask a few questions, we can take a few now. If there be any or reactions or comments. Yes.
And I noticed that you had a few recordings, but yet you said they were mostly oral histories during that time. What was the story there?
So the question is to Anne Banks about there were some recordings, but also oral histories being the question.
Well, most of the Federal Writers Project life history interviews were not recorded on any kind of tape. They were just taken down by the writers, and those things that I played were actors, just as now, for a radio series based on it. So that's what you were hearing.
Okay, yeah, can for a couple more questions over there? Sorry.
There are quite a few interviews that were done with blacks or former slaves. Were they done by other black people, or how were interviewers and interviewees paired in these situations?
That's a very good question about where African American and particularly former slave narratives that the project gathered, thousands of them, and it varied by state, to my knowledge, as to whether the interviewer was white or whether they were black. I know that in Florida, Stetson Kennedy told us that there was a African American unit of the Writers Project that was segregated from the white part, in keeping with the state's rules. But they went to great lengths to interview formerly slaved individuals. And so I know of at least one case where they traveled several hundred miles across the Florida Panhandle for just a few interviews. And so, and Stetson was very proud of the fact that in some of those interviews that the interviewee was opened up and was more open to talking about the realities of life under slavery. But it did vary state by state.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll need to combine our question period with the book signing because of time. But okay, one in the back row. Thank you.
I'll just give a testimony. I heard about some project that was interviewing people about their experiences with health care. And I talked to somebody on the phone, and it sounded so good that I wanted to participate, and then I thought, oh no, I'm not going to do that. I actually canceled out a couple times, but I did do it, and I just have to tell you how much it meant to me to be able to have some voice after coming through such a dark period with my parents in disabled old age and just being completely overwhelmed. To have a voice, to have somebody listening and paying attention, I thank you, I thank you, I thank you. What a brilliant idea this is. It means so much.
Well, thank you, and what a wonderful way to conclude a historically based program with an absolutely contemporary thank you and feeling. As I said, we were going to, you can continue the discussion, but we need to get going with the book signing. But I would really like very much to thank everyone, David, Anne, Virginia, and our two wonderful actors, John Strange and Edernonda Fudge. You folks brought this to life for us, and I've very rarely been able to be associated with such a important historical program that has come to life here today at the Library of Congress. And let's give especially David, the organizer, but everyone, a round of applause. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us, and we will have a book signing and more conversation in the back. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.